Welcome to the darkest corners of fear. The following tales are not for the faint of heart. You're about to dive deep into the terror that lurks behind every old, isolated cabin in the woods. And once you've heard these stories, you'll never look at a cabin the same way again. Make sure you subscribe to this channel, because this nightmare doesn't end here. Story 1, The Hollow Walls. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend away. A group of 4 friends rented a cabin nestled deep in the woods, isolated from the rest of the world. The kind of place where you go to disconnect, to breathe. But the moment they stepped inside, the air felt off, heavy, dense, like something was watching them. It wasn't the cabin itself. It was the feeling. The feeling that something ancient, something evil, had been living there long before they ever arrived. That night, as they sat around the fire pit outside, they heard it, the scratching. A low, persistent scraping sound, coming from deep within the cabin's walls. At first, they thought it was just the house settling. But the scratching continued. It grew louder. It was unmistakable. One of them, Josh, decided to investigate. He crept through the dark halls, flashlight trembling in his hand. The sound led him to a wall in the corner of the living room. It was coming from inside the plaster. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered and died. He stood frozen in the pitch-black room, listening to the scratching, now loud and frantic. It stopped. And then, something whispered from the walls. "Help me!" Josh screamed. He turned to run, but the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. He was trapped. The scratching resumed, but it wasn't coming from the walls anymore. It was coming from within him. The last thing the others heard before everything went silent was Josh's blood-curdling scream. Story 2, The Forgotten One. Sarah thought she had found the perfect escape. A secluded cabin by a beautiful lake, surrounded by towering pines. No neighbors for miles. It was everything she wanted, peace and quiet. At first, the weekend was everything she hoped for. She spent hours hiking, enjoying the solitude. But something started to feel wrong. The air was still, unnaturally so. Even the birds seemed to have disappeared. That night, after an exhausting day of exploring, she fell into an uneasy sleep. She awoke to a sound, something scratching at her window. A light tap, like the delicate clawing of nails on glass. Thinking it was an animal, she stood up to investigate. She peered outside, but there was nothing there, just the dark expanse of trees. But the scratching continued, louder this time. Thump, thump, thump. She turned around, and that's when she saw it. A figure standing in the hallway, its body half missing, as if something had been eaten away. Its eyes were wide, dark hollow pits, staring into her soul. And it grinned. A slow, terrifying grin that stretched across its face. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered. Before she could scream, the door slammed shut. The creature was in front of her, inches away. The last thing Sarah saw was that monstrous grin before the darkness swallowed her whole. Story 3, The Entity That Lurks. Mark had been wanting to visit the woods for years. He rented a cabin far off the beaten path. He wanted to experience the wild, untouched nature, to truly get away from everything. But what he found in that cabin was something far worse than he could have ever imagined. When he arrived, everything seemed normal. The cabin was old but charming. The surrounding woods, vast and silent. He set up his things, went for a hike, and returned by nightfall, eager to relax. But when he entered the cabin, he noticed something strange. The air was still, as though the house had stopped breathing. He went to bed, but sleep didn't come. He kept hearing noises, soft, unintelligible whispers, like voices in the wind. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. His heart raced. Something was wrong. Around midnight, the whispers turned to screams, loud, agonizing, desperate. He grabbed a flashlight and rushed outside, convinced it was someone in trouble. But there was nothing. No sign of anyone. Just the same oppressive silence. He returned to the cabin, only to find the door wide open. And then he saw it. A dark figure standing at the edge of the cabin, too tall, too thin, with a shape that shouldn't have been there. It was watching him, its face obscured by shadows, its eyes glowing like burning embers. Mark froze in terror. The figure whispered something that sent ice through his veins. "You've invited me." He tried to run, but the doors slammed shut. The walls began to shift, closing in on him as though the house itself were alive. The whispers filled his mind, screaming at him, clawing at him from every corner. The air grew thick, suffocating. And then it reached out for him. As the darkness consumed him, Mark realized too late, the cabin wasn't just haunted. It was alive. Do you feel it? That creeping dread, that uneasy sensation that has followed you from the first word of these stories? The whispers, the shadowy figures, the cold breath down your neck. You've invited something into your life by simply listening to these stories. So if you're still brave enough, subscribe now. Because the nightmare doesn't end here. It never does. You've crossed the line. And now there's no way out. The entity is watching you. And it's waiting.